The first time the police showed up at my door, I thought someone had died. Instead, an officer stood on my porch asking if she could search my garden for a rat infestation that did not exist, because my next-door neighbor had told her I was harboring vermin and threatening to kill her. I hadn't said a single word to that woman in 3 weeks. That was the moment I stopped trying to be the bigger person. And 6 months later, she would be standing at her back door, hands pressed over her ears, begging me to stop. I didn't stop. If you've ever had a neighbor who made your home feel like a war zone, someone who lied, schemed, and tried to turn the whole street against you, you are going to love this one. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and settle in because this story ends exactly the way it should. The woman next door. My name doesn't matter for this story. So let's just say I'm the guy in the small brick semi-detached house at the end of a quiet close in the north of England. I've lived there for 12 years. I know the postman by name. I know which bin day is which without checking the calendar. It's the kind of street where nothing happens, or at least it was until Sandra moved in next door with her elderly mother in the spring of 2019. First, I felt sorry for her. The story going around the street was that Sandra and her mother had been forced out of their old estate after a falling out with the neighbors there. Something about accusations she'd made against half the street, accusations that turned out to be false. I remember thinking, poor woman. That must have been awful, being run out of your own home. I didn't yet understand that Sandra wasn't the victim of that story. She was the cause of it. Took about 4 months for the mask to slip. I keep a garden. Not a fancy one, just a modest little square of lawn, a bird feeder, a hedgehog house tucked behind the shed, and enough flowering shrubs to keep the bees happy.
It's the one thing in my life I'm genuinely proud of. Robins, blue tits, the occasional woodpecker, they all come through. And because the garden's healthy and the local fox population does its job, I've never once had a pest problem. Sandra, on the other hand, developed an obsession with rats. Not real rats. Rats she'd convinced herself were coming from my garden, drawn by my bird feeders, plotting, I'm not exaggerating her words, to infest the whole close. She started scattering bright blue rodent poison pellets across her own garden, right along the shared fence line, in the open, where any bird, hedgehog, or curious pet could get to them. I know a bit about wildlife. That poison is an anticoagulant. It doesn't kill quickly. It causes internal bleeding over days, and any animal that eats a poison rat, a fox, an owl, a neighborhood cat, gets poisoned too. It's exactly the kind of careless use that wildlife officers specifically warn against, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I knocked on her door and asked her, politely, to at least keep the poison contained in a covered trap instead of scattering it loose where anything could reach it. She stared at me like I'd threatened her life. The escalation. 2 days later, 2 police officers were standing in my garden. Sandra had called them and reported that I was keeping rats deliberately and that I had threatened to kill her during our conversation. Neither of those things was true, but I stood there and let the officers do their job because I had nothing to hide. The female officer walked the length of my garden, looked at the bird feeders, the hedgehog house, the neat little vegetable patch, and said, without any prompting from me, "This is one of the nicest gardens I've seen all year. There's no way you've got a rat problem here." She apologized for the intrusion. I appreciated that, but the damage was already done. Sandra had made her opening move, and it had failed. So I made mine. I reported her to the local council for improper use of rodenticide near a protected wildlife corridor. A pest control officer visited her the following week, and for what I heard through the fence, it was not a friendly conversation. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not. For the next several weeks, my nights turned into a slow, deliberate torment. Starting around 11 p.m. and running until 2 or 3 in the morning, I would hear cupboard doors in her kitchen, which shares a wall with my bedroom, being slammed open and shut. Not once or twice. Dozens of times in bursts, clearly on purpose. Bang, 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 bang. Silence. Then it would start again 40 minutes later. I lay there some nights with my jaw clenched so tight it ached in the morning, staring at the ceiling, thinking about every version of confrontation I could have, knowing full well that any of them would just hand her more ammunition to call the police again. That was the trap. She knew I couldn't fight fire without looking like the aggressor. She'd learned that trick, I realized later, from the estate she'd been run out of. Make yourself the victim first. Make everyone else look unreasonable. It's a strategy. And for months, it worked. The turning point. The night I decided enough was enough, I hadn't slept in 4 days. I sat at my kitchen table at 3 a.m. with a cup of tea going cold in my hands. And I thought about something my grandfather used to say, you can't out-nice someone who's decided to be cruel. You can only make cruelty expensive. I didn't want a shouting match. I didn't want the police showing up again. I wanted something legal, something completely within my rights, something that would make her regret every single slammed cupboard door. And I wanted her to know, deep down, exactly why it was happening without me ever having to say a word. That's when I remembered a conversation from years earlier with a friend who played in a pipe band. He'd told me, half joking, that bagpipes are one of the only instruments in the world that sound genuinely unbearable when played badly. And that even played well, they're an acquired taste at close range. I ordered a full set the next morning. Not a practice chanter. The real thing. Part 4. The payoff. They arrived 5 days later in a long cardboard box that made my postman raise an eyebrow. I want to be clear, I'm not a musician. I have never played an instrument in my life. I looked up 3 video tutorials, learned how to get air into the bag, and accepted that I would sound less like a Highland warrior and more like a dying accordion falling down a staircase. Perfect. I started small. 10 minutes in the back garden on a Saturday afternoon, right along our shared fence line, while Sandra's mother was out and Sandra was pottering around her own garden. The sound that came out of that instrument was genuinely one of the worst things I have ever heard, a strangled, wailing groan that seemed to physically vibrate through the fence panels. I watched Sandra freeze mid-task. Her shoulders went rigid. She turned and stared at the fence like she couldn't quite process what she was hearing. I kept playing. By the 3rd day, I had practice sessions scheduled for early evening. Completely legal, completely reasonable hours. Nothing anyone could report me for. And I was getting, if anything, worse because I kept trying new tunes I clearly had no business attempting. On day 6, Sandra appeared at the fence, red-faced, and demanded I stop that racket. I smiled, genuinely smiled for the first time in weeks, and told her I had every right to practice a hobby in my own garden during reasonable hours, just like she had every right to do her cupboard organizing at 2 a.m. She didn't have a response to that. By the 2nd week, the late-night cupboard slamming had mysteriously stopped. Completely. Every single night, silence. I kept practicing anyway. Just to be thorough. Reflective wrap-up. I won't pretend this was some grand moral victory. It was petty. It was loud. It was, by any reasonable standard, completely ridiculous. But it was also fair. She'd spent months trying to make my life miserable through fear, false reports, and sleep deprivation, all while staying just careful enough to avoid consequences. The bagpipes gave me something she never gave me. A problem she couldn't run to the police about because I hadn't broken a single rule. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't loud confrontation. It's just holding up a mirror and letting someone hear for the first time exactly what they've been putting you through. If this story gave you the tiniest bit of satisfaction, smash that like button and let us know in the comments. What's the most ridiculous, perfectly legal revenge you've ever pulled off? And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there are plenty more where that came from.